everyone. My name is Lindsay. I'm the Sustainability Director at the Greenberg Nature Center. And today we're going to be talking about the importance of pollinators and specifically honeybees. So pollinators are actually responsible for pollinating about 2/3 of the food that we eat. So most of the food that you eat on a daily basis comes because of pollinators. We need the pollinators to do their job and pollinate these plants so that we can turn it into food that we enjoy. So what I want to talk about today first is honeybees. They are a very common pollinator that a lot of people know a decent amount about. So we're going to start with them, and then we're going to talk about pollinators in general. So honeybees, they like to live in a hive, obviously, and the main reason people know them, of course, is because they create honey. And the honey that they make is actually something that feeds them as well. So this is honey from our hive at the Nature Center. It might look a little bit different than the honey that you're used to seeing on the shelf in the store, and that's because it hasn't been processed. So this honey here has come right from the hive. It's very normal to see a separation and differencing in color. And that's just because there's a lot of different substances that the bees have brought to their hive and that is now in this honey, and all of it is actually healthy. A lot of people choose to eat honeys for allergies, and when you do that, you really want honey that looks like this, because that means it has all of the different pollens that are all around your area in one bottle here, and that's how it helps with allergies. So our bees are making this honey, and again, this is their food. As much as we like to enjoy it as a healthy treat or a sweet treat, this is food for the bees. So when we remove this from their hive, that does mean sometimes they might have to do more work, but most beekeepers will leave the bees the perfect amount of honey so that they can survive the entire year, especially the winter, on the honey they've left over. Most beekeepers will not remove too much honey so that the bees can survive. So that's about 60 pounds of honey that will get our honeybees through the winter. And then other than that, they use the honey to feed their babies and to also feed themselves. So honey is made from pollen and from nectar. And so I like to show this image here because this image shows a honeybee up close. And what you can see on the leg here is basically a sack of pollen. So I like to say that basically these bees have pockets like we do on our pants. And when they're flying from flower to flower, they stick the pollen inside of them in the pockets, and then they bring it back to the hive to make the honey. The other important thing to notice is that this pollen is not only in the pouch on the leg, it's also all over covering the body of the bee. And the reason for that is basically static electricity. The bee lands on the flower and static cling allows pollen to just go right onto the body. This is really important for pollination because the bees are able to move from flower to flower, moving different pollens from flower to flower without even realizing they're doing it, and therefore pollinating all of the flowers. So that's basically how these honeybees do a great job for us and help us have a really healthy and good food supply. Now, honeybees like to live in hives, and in the hive there's about 10,000 bees per hive. One bee is the queen bee. The queen bee will leave the hive just one time per year, and that will be her mating flight, and actually just one time in her entire life. She will never leave the hive again. After her mating flight, she'll return to the hive, and her only job as the queen bee is to lay eggs. So she spends her entire day laying eggs, boy and girl eggs, and the egg that she lays is actually determined by the other bees in the hive. They build the honeycomb in a shape that tells the queen if she will be laying a boy or a girl bee, and this shape can also be seen from the outside. So if you were to look inside a beehive, you could tell just by looking at how the honeycomb is capped over if you're looking at a baby bee that's going to be a girl or a baby bee that's going to be a boy. Now, from there, bees live about 9 weeks. The queen bee will live a lot longer. She's a bit different and a lot larger than the other bees, but a normal honeybee will live about 9 weeks. As they move through their life cycle, that kind of determines the job that they're going to do for their life. And so when a bee is born, a honeybee is born, their first job is really just to survive. They're going to come out of their honeycomb. So I brought here a piece with me, and this would basically slide right into the hive, and you would have stacks of them lined up, maybe 10 or 12. And you see that there's some honeycomb left here. Now the honeycomb only where the bees are born and the eggs are laid, but it's also where the honey stores are, usually in different places in the hive. So the baby bees will be in one area and the honey in a different area. Now, once they're born out of here, they begin to eat, they begin to care for themselves, and they begin to care for the hive. So we like to show these hats to kind of get people to remember. So basically your first job, or one of the first jobs after you come out and you're a healthy bee, is to be a nurse bee. So as the nurse bee, your job is to basically feed and take care of all of the babies. The queen bee could lay a lot of eggs, over 10,000 every single day. So that means there's a lot of babies that constantly need to be fed and cared for. So your first job is to be a nurse bee. After that, you graduate and you usually become a construction worker bee. So this means that your job is to build the honeycomb and build anything else that's necessary in the hive, and also cap over the honey and cap over the baby bees. From there, you become the security guard bee. So in every hive, there's a group of bees whose only job is to protect the hive. And this is a very important job, and they can protect them in a variety of ways, whether it's from predators or something that might want to harm the hive, or it could be just to keep the hive cool. In the hot summer months, the security guard bees will line up outside the entrance to the hive, and they flap their wings all day, and this helps to cool off the hive. After that, you've reached your final job as a bee, as a honeybee, and you are a drone bee. The drone bee is going to leave the hive, or the worker bee, and they're going to go out and look for that pollen and that nectar, and that's what they're going to bring back to the hive. The honeybees will basically work at that until their life ends, and then the cycle will begin again. So again, that's about 9 weeks. So when you are a honeybee, there's a few really important things to understand also when you're a beekeeper. As a beekeeper, you see a lot of beekeepers, they'll go up to a hive and they'll smoke it, and you'll see that they do that before they go in. The reason for that is because the honeybees think that there's a forest fire when that happens, and they consume all of their honey. And when they eat it, they go into what we think of as a food coma, and they get a little sleepy and a little tired, and that allows a beekeeper to enter the hive without causing any disturbance to the bees and without making them feel like they might be in harm's way. So that's one thing that you might see. Now, the bees also have a very special way of communicating with each other. So they have their own language, and the way that it works is it's called the Laggle Dance. So when a bee enters the hive, or when they're in the hive, the way they communicate is actually from dancing. And when they're dancing, they can communicate multiple things, but one of the main things they communicate to one another is where they can find a really great place for flowers, pollen, and nectar. And again, if I'm a bee, I've left the hive, I've found a beautiful field of flowers, and I want to tell my bee friends about that, I will come back, and instead of having to show them where it is, I will be able to dance, and that will tell my bee friends everything they need to know to be able to get to that place where I just came from. So they communicate through dancing, which is very cool. So a few other things that bees make, because they do make some things besides honey. So within the hive you can find pollen, and pollen just looks like this. And a lot of people who are into health will use pollen in food, and it's a really great health supplement, but again, just something that the bees gather and they store inside the hive. And then the other substance we have here is like a glue. It's called Propolis. And Propolis is basically a sticky dark brown substance that the bees make, and the Propolis helps to hold the hive together. Some beekeepers will even use it on the outside of the hive as a natural paint and a natural glue. So this is basically glue that's made by the bees. The last thing that they make is, of course, the beeswax, and that's what holds their honeycomb together. And this comes from them consuming honey and nectar and pollen, and then they basically sweat. And when they sweat on their stomach, out comes beeswax. And they basically pull it off of their stomach, and then that is how they build the walls of the hive. So everything that's happening in the hive, the bees' bodies are actually responsible for creating and for making. Okay, the last thing that I brought for us today to look at is this here. So as I was saying, bees are really responsible for pollination, and it's a very important job. So every plant that we rely on has to go through a full life cycle, as a lot of them are annual plants, the ones that we use for food. So here we have a sunflower, and if you look very closely, this is full of sunflower seeds. So every one of these is a small seed that can become a large flower again. For a flower to have a successful life, its main job and main goal is to produce seeds for the next generation to grow next year, and bees are a part of that too. Pollination is how a flower or a plant is able to have seeds, to have these babies that can create the next generation. So again, you need these bees for pollination so that we can continue to grow the fruits and the vegetables that we enjoy, and that's very important. You can even see on here that some of these actually started to bud, and you have some seeds that think it might be spring and they're trying to come up and create a new flower. So you see some of that too. My last fun fact about the bees is actually that in a hive, about 90% of the bees are actually girls. So most of the bees who are doing the work and the labor are female bees, to the point where in the fall, when the weather gets colder and the bees know that the winter is coming, they actually kick out the boy bees because they don't want them to eat all their food, and only the girl bees live in the hive during the winter time. So that is all my fun facts about the honeybees and pollination. Now the next thing I want to talk about is that we all talk about honeybees, but honeybees are actually not native. They are not from the United States. They came from Europe, again, because we wanted their honey. There are actually hundreds of native bees that are from New York State that many of us are unaware of, but are also very important for pollination and also need care. So one of the main ways that we suggest that people help these bees, and they're solitary bees. So they don't live in a hive like a honeybee would. They actually like to live alone, and they like to live in burrows or holes, and sometimes even under the ground. Now these bees, all that they need is something to be safe in. And so a pollinator box is a great way to provide them a home. And a pollinator box is something that you can look up online. They're also called pollinator hotels. And you could actually make them out of a birdhouse. And if all of us was to do something very small and impactful, that would be my suggestion, because we have to think about the hundreds of other species of bees that are really important to pollination besides our honeybee. All right, and that's all I have for you today. Thank you so much for joining us.